Now, so far we built a number of nice but simple evil files. We built stuff like the download and execute, download, report and execute, execute and report, and all of these programs are useful and can be used in so many scenarios, and the idea was to cover a small thing in each lecture, and then you'll be able to use these small functions as is, or you can mix them together to build up programs that will achieve your goal depending on your scenario. Now, I want to start doing stuff that is a little bit more complex, and the first thing that I want to do is build a keylogger. Now, a keylogger is basically a program that records all key strikes entered on the keyboard. From this description, you can see that this program can be very useful in so many scenarios, and it's used a lot throughout penetration testing, because if you manage to plant this program on a system using social engineering or by physically transferring this file to a computer and executing it, once this program works, it's going to record everything that the user enter on their keyboard. So this will include usernames, passwords, chat messages, or anything they literally do. Now, there are already a number of keyloggers that are ready to use and you can download and use yourself. And the common features that you'll see in these keyloggers are some of them will store the key strikes on the local machine, and hence the name local keyloggers. And then there are keyloggers that will send you the logs or the key strikes to an email or to your own server, and these are called remote keyloggers, and these are actually more useful in my opinion, because in many scenarios you'd want to be able to see the key strikes remotely without having to get back to the computer where the keylogger is installed. Some of them will also take screenshots and start with the system startup. But for now, let's forget about all of these features and let's focus on the main goal. And once we get the main goal, as you see, the main features are just going to be small functions that will be easy to implement, and you probably already know how to implement some of these small features. So the main goal is to write a program that can record keys entered through the keyboard. Now, to do this with Python, it's actually very, very easy. We're going to use a library called PyInput. I'm going to include a link in the resources for the documentation of this library if you want to learn more about it, but I'm going to cover it in this lecture and the next few lectures anyway. So the first thing that you need to do is install this library because it doesn't come pre-installed with Kali. So as usual, when we want to install a Python module, all we do is pip install followed by the module or the library name, and in my case it's called PyInput. Now it's telling me that this is already installed for me. For you, it should install it with no errors. There is no need to configure anything. And once it's installed, we're ready to write our program. And we'll start as usual by importing this library. So we're going to do import PyInput. Now this library allows us to monitor mouse and keyboard, and it also allows us to control mouse and keyboard, so we can literally send key strikes and mouse clicks. But we're only interested into recording the keyboard, so we're only going to import pyinput.keyboard. Next, we're going to create a keyboard listener object that will listen for key strikes entered on the keyboard. So I'm going to create a variable called keyboard listener, and I'm going to make this equal to the library that I just downloaded, which is PyInput, and I want to use .keyboard, and I want to create a listener. So basically what we're doing is we're creating an instance of a listener object that we are taking from the pyinput.keyboard, which we imported in here. And what we want to do in here, we want to specify a callback function to be executed every time a key strike is entered. So this is something similar to the sniff function with Scapy when we specified a callback function in the prn argument, so that callback function was executed every time we received the packet. This time, we're going to say onPress equal to the name of the callback function that we want to be executed every time a key strike or the user presses a key on the keyboard. So I'm going to call this function process key press. And then I'm going to implement this function in here. So I'm going to define a new function, and the function name is going to be called process key press. And this function is going to take a variable. This variable is going to be the key that the user has pressed. And all I'm going to do inside this function for now is print the key. So this is actually very similar to what we were doing with Scapy. We're specifying a callback function to be executed every time a user presses a key on the keyboard. The name of this callback function can be anything, and I'm choosing to call it process key press. Then I implemented process key press just like any other function. It takes a variable called key, and then I'm printing the key on screen. Now, going back to our code, we created the keyboard listener, but we didn't start this listener. So we have a variable that holds an instance of the keyboard listener, but we haven't done anything with this. Now, to start this, first of all, we're going to use the with keyboard. Now, you've seen an example of using this when we were opening files to read or to write, but here we have a different example of using it to interact with the keyboard listener. Basically, the with keyboard in Python is used to interact with unmanaged streams of data. So something like opening a file or using a listener like the one that we're going to use right now. So we're going to say with keyboard listener, I want to start this listener by doing keyboard listener dot join. And that's it, we're done. Now keep in mind, I've actually read through the documentation of PyInput, which I'm going to include in the resources of this lecture, and this is usually the same with everything that I show or teach in here. I don't know everything about Python, I know the basics, and then when I want to use a module, I read the documentation, and I learn about how to use it, and then use it. So for example, I didn't know that there was a join method that I can use with the keyboard listener in order to start it. But reading through the documentation, I knew that's how to do it. Another thing to mention, for example, I didn't know that the callback function has to be passed to onPress. For example, with Scapy, we had to pass it to the PRN. In here, we're passing it to onPress. Again, reading the documentation will cover all of this and will allow you to know all of these things. So you can't just learn them by default. Now, we have our very basic keylogger done, and if you look at the code, it's actually very, very simple, but it works well. First of all, we're creating a variable which is going to hold an instance of the listener object of the PyInput library, which we imported here. And basically what we're saying is for every time a key is pressed on the keyboard, I want you to call a function called process key press. The process key press function will take a variable called key and will print the key on the screen. And then I'm interacting with my listener, and I'm starting the listener by putting the listener name.join. Now let's go to our terminal, and I'm already in the working directory of my project, of my keylogger. So I'm just going to do Python keylogger.py. I'm going to hit enter. This will start the keylogger for me. And just as a test, I'm going to go to this second terminal window and I'm going to start typing some characters. And you'll see as soon as I start typing stuff on my keyboard, it's going to be logged and displayed on screen in here. So let's just type, this is a test. And as you can see, we have all the characters being logged in here. And you can even see the space key is being logged as a space key. Now, if I press tab, you'll see that we have key.tab. If you press any of the special keys like a down arrow or an up arrow, everything is going to be displayed on screen and logged through our program. Now, if we want to kill this, I'm just going to do kill all Python, and that'll kill all Python programs, including the one that's running right now. Now we have a basic keylogger, and we managed to solve the main issue with building a keylogger. So the main purpose of a keylogger program is to be able to record key strikes. So now we're able to record the key strikes, and everything that comes after here is going to be polishing the code and implementing the features that make the keylogger useful.